In 722 BCE, the vassal state of Israel rebelled against the Assyrians and suffered a crippling defeat. This sent Israelite refugees fleeing south from their destroyed lands of Israel to the southern kingdom of Judah, bringing with them a variety of traditions previously unobserved by the Judeans. Most notable among these northern kingdom traditions was the idea that Yahweh was the only God to be worshipped. The Midianite god was already worshipped in Judah, holding a prominent place in the temple in Jerusalem, but he was hardly the only god who received praise there. The copper serpent Nehushtan, the father god El Elyon and his wife Asherah, along with many others, possibly dozens of others, all shared space within the temple. This wasn't pagan encroachment into the monotheistic temple, as we are told in the Bible, but the purpose of the temple since its founding. The people of ancient Palestine had been worshiping these gods and more than 70 others for thousands of years before they ever even learned about Yahweh. Then, in 640 BCE, an 8-year-old child named Josiah was placed on the throne by wealthy landowners and used as a puppet to unify power in the kingdom. To accomplish this, they needed to permanently link the government with the religion, establishing the nation as a vassal of Yahweh instead of a vassal of Assyria. For this new covenant to stick, the competing gods needed to go, and for that to happen, this new format had to be given an ancient pedigree. The current method had to be made into a blasphemous corruption of the intended form of government and worship. And the best way to convince opponents that following their old gods was a terrible idea was to blame that practice for their recent military defeat and servitude at the hands of the Assyrians. So a new document was drafted, one which described the new temple arrangement and national covenant as the original format and presented the current state of affairs as a punishment for violating this covenant with Yahweh. The document was then presented as an ancient manuscript supposedly written 6 centuries earlier, and used as a model for the restructuring of the government and the temple, which was already underway. It would be expanded over the next century or so, but the central theme would remain the same. This ancient forgery used to justify a nationwide reform became known as the Book of Deuteronomy. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. The Book of Deuteronomy is a law code presented as a series of sermons by Moses. The core, which we find in chapters 5 through 26, are the oldest portions of the book, with the rest added during the following century and a half. The final additions, being a new introduction and conclusion, were added sometime after the Babylonian exile. In this book, we see a stark contrast to the themes we noticed in Exodus and Numbers, notably the idea that only the sons of Aaron can be priests in the temple. Here in Deuteronomy, passages relating to that idea are completely absent. Those themes, which come from a source scholars call the priestly writer, were added to Exodus and Numbers after the composition of Deuteronomy. In fact, of the 5 books of the Torah, Deuteronomy stands as the only book compiled from a single source, the Deuteronomic source. All others contain entries from multiple editors, including the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly sources. While I'd like to present more information on this topic, I will probably not devote an entire episode to it. I'd suggest Googling the term documentary hypothesis and spending about 10 minutes reading an overview of the idea. But the basic concept is that the Torah was compiled in 4 stages, with the Deuteronomic phase being one of the later stages, followed closely by the priestly redaction that forbade the Levites from ever becoming priests, as we've seen in the last 2 episodes. But in the book of Deuteronomy, the Levites are not forbidden from becoming priests. That idea hasn't been introduced yet by the Zadokite priests, as they haven't yet driven the Levites out of the temple. Once they do, they'll snatch up copies of scriptures, namely Numbers, and add passages that cast the recently ousted Levites in a terrible light, and pronounce themselves as the only rightful servants of Yahweh. Of course, they'll use Yahweh as a sock puppet to get their point across, but for now, the people in charge are still the Levites. Yahwism is taking hold in the southern kingdom of Judah, and the myriad gods worshipped in the temple have recently been cast out. The priests that praise Leviathan have come in from the countryside as their hilltop altars were closed, and they're now serving only one god, the volcano god Yahweh. If you're looking for an exciting book, Deuteronomy is not the book to read. In a way, it's a rehash of Leviticus. It's all about law and covenant. It's an agreement between Yahweh and Israel. Behave like this, and I'll look out for you. Ignore my wishes, and I'll smite the hell out of every man, woman, and child until you're all dead. That's pretty much the gist of the entire book. But how did they get there? The ancient Palestinians began with over 70 different deities, worshipping a vast pantheon, where each god or goddesses was responsible for a different aspect of the natural world. After thousands of years of this, they began the slow move toward monotheism. This wasn't a conscious effort, nor did it occur in a single generation or even a single century. The head of the Israelite pantheon was the Canaanite god El Elyon. Later, perhaps 1000 BCE, give or take a century, Yahweh made his way up from Midian and Edom. He was adopted into the Canaanite pantheon as a son of El, and we will see a reference to this near the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Yahwism grew in popularity, possibly due to the Israelites seeking protection from the numerous invaders that conquered their nation one after another over the centuries. Eventually, their new god Yahweh ousted Baal-Hadad worship and absorbed his stories and his traits, including control over the weather, the clouds, and the harvest. Around this time, he became the patron deity of Israel. And that's where our book begins. The Israelites are taking their next step toward monotheism. Yahweh has slowly been moving toward the forefront with the rejection of Baal in the 8th and 9th centuries BCE, and is now, here in the 6th and 7th centuries BCE, demanding to be worshipped exclusively among the gods. Now, they don't yet reject the idea that other deities exist, as we'll see in chapter 32, but only one God should be followed. The first few chapters of Deuteronomy are like the first 90 seconds of a TV show. It begins with previously on the adventures of Moses, and then goes on to recount the entire trek out of Egypt and through the wilderness. Then there's a rehash of the Ten Commandments and the Civil Law Code. Conspicuously absent are all those tales about the Levites irritating Yahweh and being set on fire for their insolence. Now, supposedly, this is all written by Moses himself while the Israelites are on the east side of the Jordan before they're crossing into the Promised Land. However, there's a dead giveaway that this is not the case in chapter 1, verse 1, when the author states, "These are the words that Moses addressed to all of Israel on the other side of the Jordan." Two problems here. First, the author is talking about Moses, not claiming to be Moses. In fact, nowhere in the Torah, anywhere, does it say that Moses wrote down the Torah. Second, the author sees the events as if he's already inside of Israel because he refers to the location as being on the other side of the Jordan. And as we know from the story, Moses never crossed the Jordan. Another issue from the beginning of the tale comes in chapter 5. When Moses reviews the covenant with the people, he reminds them of the covenant they agreed upon at Mount Sinai, reminding them that they were there at the time. The exact quote is, "Yahweh made this covenant not with our fathers, but with us, even us, who were all of us here alive this day." Now that's pretty specific. It leaves no room for debate. The people who stood at the foot of Mount Sinai when Yahweh made his covenant with them in Exodus are the same people who are now listening to Moses in Deuteronomy. However, according to the book of Numbers, all of those people are now dead. That was the entire purpose of the 40-year wandering. They all had to die. Yet here in Deuteronomy, every last one of them is still alive. And the reason they all had to die, doubting Yahweh when they faced a nation full of Nephilim, is completely missing from Deuteronomy. In fact, when they finally cross the Jordan in the opening chapters of Joshua, they find a nation full of cowardly people easy to annihilate, not giant demigods. And when they talk to a young harlot in the Promised Land, she remembers when the crossing of the Sea of Reeds occurred. According to Deuteronomy and Joshua, they traveled from Egypt to Canaan in a much shorter time period than the book of Numbers claims. Throughout the book of Deuteronomy, we see numerous warnings about worshiping pagan gods, and the phrasing is suspicious to say the least, such as commanding the Israelites to not worship foreign gods you have never known. Why refer to them as gods they have never known unless they're trying to deny the fact that the ancestors of your audience did know them? The effort to distance the current population from its polytheistic roots occurs multiple times in Deuteronomy, including direct references to the idols that so recently adorned the temple in Jerusalem, as we see in chapter 4, commands to ignore the gods of their land, which we see in chapter 6, the command to destroy all the idols they have in the temple in chapter 7, more prescriptions against polytheism in chapter 8, stating that the old ways are wicked in chapter 9, and on and on. Also in chapter 9, it states that their golden calf was smashed and thrown into a stream. But according to Exodus 32, it was ground into dust and the people were forced to eat it. It's just one of the many indications that these stories had different authors, and even different scenes within the same story could have separate authors. Now we get a repeat of the claim that the current audience is made up of the same people who left Egypt in chapter 11, when Moses is relating Yahweh's demands to the people to keep his laws once they have entered the Promised Land. Chapter 11, verse 7 tells us that the people in attendance are those who witness Yahweh's miracles in Egypt, so the 40 years of wandering until all are dead isn't part of this tale. Deuteronomy, or its authors, know nothing about it. The Israelites left Egypt, traveled to several places, then moved on to the Promised Land in short order, perhaps a couple of years, though no time frame is ever stated. We only know that this is not a future generation, a fact that is repeatedly stated, but the same people who celebrated the first Passover. In fact, as there is no mention of another Passover from the Deuteronomic author until the crossing of Jordan, despite the summary of their entire journey, I believe it's safe to assume that according to Deuteronomy, the journey from Egypt to Jericho took exactly 1 year, leaving immediately after the final plague and the first Passover in Egypt, and arriving in time to celebrate the next Passover upon crossing the Jordan. And considering the miraculous water crossing associated with each, the Sea of Reeds with the first and the Jordan with the second, a 1-year timeline for the journey would have a literary symmetry that the scripture writers seem to enjoy. Now, in keeping with the idea that everything that happens, or has already happened, is a direct result of their covenant with Yahweh, we are told in chapter 11 that obeying his laws will result in good weather and an even more stable harvest and food supply than they once enjoyed in Egypt. But failing to follow his instructions will result in punishments, like failed crops. I find this a bit ironic since the entire reason they were forced to leave the Promised Land in the first place and travel to Egypt was because of failed crops. This is a way for the Levite priests of the Reformed temple to blame their past troubles on their pagan ways. Remember all those burnt crops? That's because you worshipped other deities. This really old document that I just found yesterday says so. So chapter 11 also connects Yahweh to the spring and autumn rains, something previously under the purview of Baal, who was assimilated into Yahweh a few centuries earlier. It is immediately followed by another warning against worshiping other deities. I can't help but notice a connection between these two passages. One ascribes attributes formerly associated to the native god Baal to Yahweh, and the very next passage forbids the worship of any other god than Yahweh. To someone living in ancient Judah who still remembered Baal and the transition of power over the weather from their native god of the harvest to the Midianite war god, I believe the connection would be obvious. We also see another Baal connection in chapter 32 when Yahweh says, "May my discourse come down as rain, my speech distill as the dew, like showers on young growth, like droplets on the grass." Baal was a god who brought rain that replenished the soil and helped with the growth of grain. Earlier stories of Yahweh offer no connection to the rain or to grass. Chapter 32 and the poem of Yahweh contain something else of interest, but we'll come back to that near the end of the episode. The prohibition on worship of other gods continues in chapter 12 as Moses begins relating the laws the Israelites must follow while in the Promised Land. He begins by saying they must destroy all the sites where the other gods are worshipped. They must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred posts, and cut down the images of their gods. This coincides with the purging of the Jerusalem temple of all other deities, including the healing snake Nehushtan and El's wife Asherah. This is also a clear move toward the vague and impersonal style of worship that we saw in Egypt under Akhenaten. Images of gods, including images of the one God they were allowed to worship, were forbidden. God was a mysterious figure not meant to be envisioned. Aten was hidden behind a temple wall, only accessible through an elite priestly class, and outside worship sites were all closed down. All Aten worship was centralized, and so too is it commanded for Yahweh. We see a statement that the Israelites are not to worship Yahweh in a manner similar to the worship of these other gods. Yet no examples of these styles of worship which are forbidden are ever given. And even a cursory study of the types of worship and practices common to El, Asherah, Baal, Akhenaten, and Moloch reveal that those practices which Yahweh accepts are all borrowed from other gods native to either Canaan or Egypt. This is another example of assimilation and obfuscation. The practices which the Levite priests consider pagan are already the part of Yahwism. But by omitting examples when stating that pagan practices are forbidden, they conceal this fact. A feast of unleavened bread couldn't possibly come from an ancient Canaanite festival because that would be against Yahweh's wishes, so it must be of Yahwistic origin. Chapter 12 also condemns the abhorrent methods of sacrifice by these pagans to their strange gods, citing child sacrifice as an example. But it clearly ignores the numerous times, even as late as the end of Numbers, when Yahweh himself commands and accepts child sacrifices. We will see more examples of Yahweh enjoying child sacrifice in later books, such as Judges. These prohibitions on styles of worship continue into chapter 13, when Yahweh commands death to diviners. Future prophets that speak in opposition to the temple priest should be put to death. This means that anyone who objects the reforms occurring at the time of this writing do so at their own peril. It even states that if anyone in another town or tribe tries to tempt people away from the reformed temple, the entire town must be killed, including its cattle. Everything must be burned to the ground. Of course, the only way of avoiding this, should your neighbor or relative speak out against the temple, is for you to murder them, as is stated in Deuteronomy 13:7-11. The topic of diviners is revisited again in chapter 18, stating there that Yahweh has never used diviners. Yet this contradicts the stories of Abraham and Joseph, and even Moses, who all practiced divination. This practice, along with child sacrifice, are the reasons listed for Yahweh's decision to exterminate the inhabitants of the Promised Land and give their property to the Israelites. So, in short, the Canaanites are being exterminated for doing the exact thing that Yahweh has commanded the Israelites to do on numerous occasions. It should also be mentioned that in chapter 18, we're told that Moses will be raised up as a prophet, and all who follow are likely to be false prophets. In Deuteronomy 18:22, Yahweh states that any prophecy that fails to come true must be the product of a failed prophet, and such men must be put to death. It should also be mentioned that every prophet in the Bible, including Jesus himself, uttered failed prophecies. Now, as we see in Leviticus, certain animals are considered unclean based on their physical descriptions, not matching up with what the author considered to be normal. We see this again in chapter 14 of Deuteronomy. Proper herd animals are listed and their physical traits described. Improper animals are also listed, and their status as being improper is explained by not fitting the proper physical description. Foodborne pathogens are never hinted at. At no point does the text say that eating swine will make you sick. It continues on to describe proper fish, and even repeats the statement that bats are birds. The old practice of cooking a baby goat in its mother's milk as part of their religion is once again prohibited. More of their old practices are mentioned in chapter 16, but these are practices that are being kept, and so they're not only allowed, their continuance is commanded. These include the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, all ancient Canaanite festivals involving other gods. Ancient pagan festivals are now being commanded to be observed by Yahweh. This is followed by the prohibition against setting up sacred poles and posts behind Yahweh's altar, which is a reference to the Asherah poles that were recently removed from the Temple of Jerusalem. And it might be noted that for a short period of time, perhaps only a century or two, Asherah was considered to be Yahweh's wife. Prior to that, Asherah was the wife of El Elyon, Yahweh's adoptive father. All of this shifts powers away from outside altars and toward the central temple. But perhaps the most power-centric passage in the entire book comes at the end of chapter 17, when a command is given that any future king will be required to not only read this text, referring to Deuteronomy, but must also obey it. A clever addition to a text that will be given to a puppet king who is placed on the throne by powerful men. The passage also prohibits kings from amassing wealth and from having multiple wives. Prohibitions, that I might add, are not placed on the temple priests. In fact, with all the donations the nation of Israel must give to the priests, which include captured virgin girls, it's impossible for them to avoid amassing wealth and an expansive harem. It's passages like this that reveal the true intentions of the authors of this particular book. And speaking of captured slaves, the capture and use of slaves is again outlined in chapter 20, when Yahweh outlines the procedure for destroying a town. All adult males are to be executed, whether they're soldiers or not. Women, children, and livestock are to be taken and used however the soldiers see fit. This procedure is for any town they attack outside of the Promised Land. Those inside the Promised Land, however, are to be swept clean. All men, women, children, animals, and even the trees must be destroyed. All Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites must be wiped out. Yahweh commands total genocide of 5 different peoples. After this, we get a series of laws designed to reduce the amount of evil in the Promised Land. Proper behavior is outlined in the following chapters with corresponding punishments. Disobedient children are to be executed, and Yahweh outlines the proper method of impalement as a punishment for certain crimes. They're not all bad. There are pleasant laws as well, such as the command to return lost livestock that you have found to its proper owner, and to install safety measures on your roof to prevent people from falling off to their death. It also tells us that if we are hungry and come across a nest of birds, we may eat the babies, but not the babies and the mother. Eating the mother along with the babies will result in Yahweh causing you to die. And to think, he can prohibit the annihilation of a bird's nest, but can't be bothered to say anything about slavery. But it's not all good. Deuteronomy 22:23 tells us that if a woman is promised to one man, but another man rapes her, you should execute them both, because killing a rape victim along with her rapist gets rid of evil. But if the girl is not engaged to be married, then she is to be sold to her rapist as his wife. Now, before we move on past the law code and into the portion of Deuteronomy that describes the curses and blessings, we need to make a quick stop by chapter 26 for a curious passage. There is a prayer that the Israelites are given to recite, which begins with a description of Jacob as the father of the nation of Israel. It goes like this: "My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation." The problem here is that the time of Jacob should be around 1500 to 1600 BCE, yet he's described as an Aramean, who weren't around until long after the time that Joshua lived. Like the statement in Genesis that Abraham was from the city of Ur of the Chaldees, indicating the story was being written at a time closer to the Babylonian exile, this passage in Deuteronomy points to a time in history around that of the Assyrian conquest or later. Throughout the Torah, a collection supposedly dating to the 12th or 14th centuries BCE, whenever the story makes any connection with history, it mentions people or events which will not appear for many centuries to come. The sermons of Moses conclude with a combination of threats and promises to the people and the nation of Israel. As mentioned in the intro to this episode, the purpose of this book was to give an ancient pedigree to the national reform under King Josiah. Part of the encouragement for compliance is a series of threats and promises made by Yahweh to the nation of Israel. These fill the entirety of chapters 27 and 28. The way it works is simple. If the Israelites fail to obey the commands of Yahweh, and by extension the Levite priests, then they will receive the most horrific punishments imaginable. These curses extend to their children, their livestock, their kneading bowls, and even their produce. They include disease, blight, mildew, and even Yahweh himself personally attacking the people. Inflammation and hemorrhoids will afflict them, and they will never recover. Madness, blindness, and the constant threat of abuse and robbery will overshadow them. It even states that Yahweh will drive the Israelites into other lands where they will be forced to worship other gods. A curious punishment coming from a jealous God who wants to be the sole object of worship. And it states that a strange nation will come from afar to attack them and besiege their towns and tear down their walls. To me, this sounds like a reference to Babylon, whose residents do not speak a Semitic tongue, and not only besieged Israel, but tore down their towers and walls. Then there's a truly disturbing passage. In Deuteronomy 28:53, it says the Israelites will be besieged and be forced to resort to cannibalism, eating their own children. And women will eat their own babies and the afterbirth, refusing to share the flesh with their husbands. This makes me wonder if, during the siege of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians, if the Israelites had to resort to cannibalism in order to survive. Later in the Bible, in association with the siege of Babylon, we will hear another description of men and women eating their own children. Either way it goes, if anyone believes that this book is the inspired Word of God, I cannot understand how they could read the Bible and conclude that their God was anything short of evil. All this and more will come to the Israelites if they fail to properly serve Yahweh. Most of these are references to the things that had already occurred during the recent Assyrian invasion and the defeat at the hands of Babylon. Posing it this way gives the impression that the document predicted the outcomes of those recent wars and offers punishment for improper religious practices as an explanation for why they lost. Of course, it then goes on to say that if they obey all of the commands that Yahweh has given and follow the instructions of the temple priests, then all of these curses will be reversed. All the things that were previously cursed will now be blessed. All of their enemies will die rather than be victorious. Their crops will grow instead of wither, etc. Then in chapter 30, it says that all of the curses will befall them anyway, followed by a period in which they are blessed. So there's no getting around Yahweh cursing them and trying to wipe them from existence. It's just something they'll have to suffer through. Though since the curses state that every single Israelite will be wiped out, I'm not exactly sure how they're supposed to eventually be blessed. I guess we just have to take it on faith. Now it also warns that even though Yahweh will eventually bless them and be on their side, ensuring victory in battle, it does warn against the possibility of future defeat. When you have to account for future failures, you don't exactly have complete faith in victory. After this, Yahweh gives Moses his final instructions, which include him writing down all of these rules and passing them on to the sons of Levi so they can be priests. Later, the Levites will be ousted and prohibited from regaining their position as temple priests. Chapter 31 also has Yahweh informing Moses that the Israelites will soon begin to worship other gods, but will eventually come back to following Yahweh exclusively. Because of this, Yahweh will soon hide his face from the people as a punishment. However, elsewhere in the Torah, it states that anyone who sees Yahweh's face will instantly die. So this might not be much of a punishment. This discrepancy is due to the fact that some writers believed that seeing Yahweh's face was a blessing, while others believed that the form of Yahweh had to be perpetually hidden from the people. Both of which, however, use their own particular view to explain why their God must be hidden from view. Yahweh says that he will bring death and life. He will wound and he will heal. Now this closely resembles a passage we will later see in Isaiah 45:7, when Yahweh says, I form the light and create darkness. I bring peace and create evil. I, Yahweh, do all these things. As the Israelites moved from polytheism to monotheism, they faced an interesting conundrum. Where does evil come from? When they had multiple gods, they could blame tragedy on deities that caused disaster, like storms, floods, tidal waves, etc., or just the petty bickering between the gods. But without a plurality of deities, they needed an explanation for losing a war, for death, for disaster. So all good and all evil must therefore come from one source, Yahweh. In a century, that would all change with the introduction of Zoroastrianism. After the final instructions are given, Yahweh blesses Moses one last time before the old coot's death. At the beginning of the blessings in chapter 33, we read that Yahweh came from Sinai, shone upon the Israelites from Seir, and appeared from Mount Paran. It's interesting that the point of origin for Yahweh is not inside the Promised Land. Instead, his works involve mountaintops in foreign lands. We've seen numerous examples, especially in Exodus, of mountain imagery associated with Yahweh, and this is another to add to the growing list. The list of mountains where Yahweh appeared is then followed by lightning imagery, which we have also seen before, usually in conjunction with descriptions of volcanic eruption, such as mentions of shaking ground, fire on the mountaintop, plumes of smoke, falling rock, heated ground, etc. After he is blessed, Moses then ascends to the top of Mount Nebo so that he can die. If you remember, this is necessary because it's now time for the people to invade Canaan, and Moses cannot accompany them because once upon a time he touched a rock with a stick and is now being punished for it. So he walks up to the mountain and dies there, having never set foot in the Promised Land. And that's the book of Deuteronomy, supposedly written in 12 to 1400 BCE, but in actuality only predates the New Testament by about 600 or so years. It's a political document used to justify radical reform, shifting the people of Judah away from the thousands of years of polytheistic worship and toward a monotheistic mindset. But the journey from a vast pantheon to a true monotheistic religion isn't over yet. To finalize the transformation, they'll need a little help from the outside. They'll need help from an unlikely source, a Persian missionary named Ezra. Like I said earlier, up until the 5th century BCE, the Israelites were not monotheistic. They were worshiping only one God, but they still believed in many. And one of those, the father of all the gods, was even higher than Yahweh himself. To illustrate the point, I'll leave you with that verse from chapter 32 that I promised earlier in the episode. And since most publishers of the Bible find this particular verse troublesome, and thus have strong tendencies to alter it drastically, I'm going to read instead from an older version which hasn't been redacted by modern Christian ministries. So this is the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, as read from the oldest known surviving copy of that verse in the world. And you can hear for yourself the polytheistic views of the Israelites as the Father God, El Elyon, divides up the nations of the world among his many children and gives his favorite nation to his favorite son. When El Elyon gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the children of men, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of God. And for Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob the lot of his inheritance. That's all for this episode. If you have any questions or comments, drop us a line at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis. Subscribe and rate us on iTunes. And again, thank you for listening.